Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Storytellers podcast. In this episode, I have the pleasure of talking once again with an old professor of mine, Douglas MacFarlane, a chemistry professor at Monash University. He featured previously on the podcast discussing renewable energy sources and technologies for the future. And in this conversation, which kind of led from that one, we go over our global food supply and the production of our food supply, in particular our agricultural food supply. And we discuss how, at least at this point in time, the consumption of fossil fuels is inextricably linked to the production of certain foods and also certain components of that agricultural system. And we find that, or at least Douglas elucidates us on the fact that a transition away from from fossil fuels to a renewable energy source within those systems might not be as easy as we might hope, and may in fact have some unintended consequences for certain groups. So, without further ado, I give you Douglas MacFarlane. So, today I have the pleasure of talking again to Douglas MacFarlane, a professor of chemistry at Monash University. Douglas featured on the first episode of the podcast talking about renewable technologies and sustainable fuels for the future. So, Douglas, thanks for joining me again.
Hi, Lucian, happy to do so.
Awesome, cool. So, last time we spoke, we talked at length about the topics that I just mentioned, but there was one little topic that we talked about prior to that podcast, and I think very briefly just glossed over within it, and that was the topic of our food supply, our global food supply, and our agricultural system being founded upon and very, very much powered by fossil fuels in the form of nitrogen production or ammonia production as a fertiliser for those systems. So I suppose, and this episode is now to a brief little segment to touch on that and explore that a little more, and the implications that has for our global quest for a more sustainable and greener future. So, Douglas, maybe to kick us off with that, you could just reiterate why it is that fossil fuels are so crucial to this production of ammonia as a fertilizer for crop supplies.
Right, so artificial fertilizers are very much a completely central part of modern agriculture. It's a simple fact that the planet Earth could not support the population of humans that we currently do today without artificially produced fertilizers. And this was a technology, shall we say, that was developed in the early 1900s, sort of around about 1908 or thereabouts, was when the first breakthroughs in making artificial fertilizers. Prior to that, it was bird guano and rock phosphates and various quite difficult to access limited forms of fertilizers that were available. And two very famous chemists, Haber and Bosch, working somewhat together, but in the end, Bosch more or less came after Haber, developed this process by which nitrogen from the air around us could be separated from the air and then reduced with hydrogen in a high temperature, high pressure reactor. So a bit of heavy duty chemistry here to produce ammonia. And from ammonia, you can directly produce. You can use it directly as it is as a fertilizer, but you can also produce all of the common garden fertilizers that we use today, including urea and ammonium phosphate and ammonium sulfate. So those are all the sorts of things that you would find in the box of fertilizer, soluble fertilizer that you would buy in the supermarket or in the hardware store. Um, the thing that
And
I
that was
just
a very significant process, wasn't it? Because typically, splitting ammonia, a triple bonded molecule is N2, sorry, is very difficult and only occurs under very extreme conditions, say within heart of volcanoes or through lightning strikes. So that was that ability to artificially fixate nitrogen was really quite a significant development.
That's right. Yeah, a very, very stable molecule, so it's very hard to get it to do anything by way of chemical reactions, which is exactly what we're trying to do here. So, the point that I just mentioned and then moved on a moment ago was of course that we use hydrogen in this process, and the hydrogen comes from fossil fuels. In particular, natural gas. There are some Haber-Bosch plants in the world that actually use coal, which is an even more effectively non-sustainable process than using natural gas. But most modern plants in the Western world use natural gas, and for that reason, the factories, the plants are often situated wherever there is a large supply of natural gas. In Australia's case, some of the significant plants are up in the far northwest of Western Australia, where there is all of the northwest gas. So as you make the hydrogen then from the natural gas in a process called steam methane reforming, and that's a fancy word for just a rather simple chemical reaction which reacts the natural gas with water and produces hydrogen. And here's the bad outcome finally coming out here: CO2. So the carbon that is in that fossil fuel is eventually emitted as carbon dioxide from this process, and there's a very simple relationship in the end, then sort of simple stoichiometric chemistry that relates the amount of ammonia that's produced to the amount of carbon dioxide that is produced. So it's an intimate relationship. All of our fertilizers are effectively a fossil fuel product, and therefore all of our food is effectively a fossil fuel product.
Based on this, what you call black hydrogen, which we touched on, or blue hydrogen, if that CO2 is then being captured and sequestered somewhere else, but typically at such a large scale, in particular, black hydrogen, that very unsustainable form of hydrogen.
That's right, which is almost entirely the situation today.
Yeah. So I wondered if you might be able to just provide us with an idea of the amount of CO2 being emitted as a byproduct of our ammonia production efforts for a global food supply.
So in round numbers, globally, about 2% of CO2 emissions globally come from fertilizer production. So it's a significant amount of CO2, which ultimately will have to be addressed as we try to pare back on all sources of CO2 emissions.
Yeah, and because part of the move to sustainability in a greener world is obviously, let's say, or at least what's been tied in with that is a movement away from, and perhaps with the ethical changes, the broad sort of ethical changes that come with that, is a move away from livestock farming and towards a more vegetarian world, perhaps where our food supply is perhaps based more heavily upon crops, which of course themselves take up a lot of land, and as we've just seen, as we're discussing right now, have their own carbon footprint, which is in fact quite extensive. So I was wondering if you had a comparison, perhaps you at hand, between greenhouse gas emissions from agricultural food supply, from crops, versus from livestock, say from cattle
Yeah. So
farming around the world.
perhaps as an intermediate stepping stone towards that kind of comparison. So the 2% globally, and it's hard to pin that down to any particular country, because of course fertilizers are an internationally traded commodity. A lot of the urea that we use in Australia is produced in China, for example. So it's best to look at that in a global sense. It's worth noting that by the time we've taken that urea or that ammonia out of the factory and finally, put it on a ship, moved it around in trucks, moved it around in the tractor, and finally got it onto the land, we've probably doubled, a bit more than doubled that CO2 footprint. So by the time you've finally got it to the land,
So that's not factored into that 2%.
no, that's just production. That is just the chemistry, if you like, of producing. So
Yeah.
add all these other parts, which of course are inevitably part of the story. We're probably upwards around of about 5% of global emissions are related to that production and supply and application of fertilizers. So then of course the next step that you're asking about is, well, how does this then ultimately play into the food that we eat? And the first thing to, of course, note is that the further up the food chain the source of our food is, in other words, livestock as opposed to crops, effectively the efficiency of the utilization of that fertilizer goes down. In other words, the amount of this is the flip side of the coin, then the amount of nitrogen that is used to produce the grass that feeds the cattle that we ultimately eat as meat, of course, is much greater than if we just ate the equivalent amount of crops, of so on. So there's no question that the higher up the food chain we are, the less efficient we are in terms of that nitrogen usage, or alternatively, the bigger our carbon footprint is with that food, because of the amount of nitrogen that's gone into making that food at high up the food chain.
So it's not ammonia. It's not nitrogen just for crops. It's for cattle farming too.
Well,
it's something that needs to be considered.
it goes into everything that ultimately we eat. The cattle eat the grass, and the grass is fertilized with those fertilizers. But of course, the efficiency, if you like, of calories eaten is probably the simplest way of looking at it. Calories eaten as beef has used ultimately a lot more fertilizer to make it than the equivalent number of calories as, say, wheat eaten. So I'm not a vegetarian, by the way. It is the reality of the situation. Then there's a secondary. So we're just talking then about the carbon emissions that are implicit in our food, right, because of fertilizers, and the application of them. But there's when you mention cattle, there's a secondary issue there, and maybe there's even a third issue I'll come back to. But it's the secondary issue with livestock, all livestock, but worse with cattle than sheep and other livestock, is of course the methane emissions that come from their metabolism, from their stomachs, basically. Which in Australia, for example, something like 11% of our greenhouse gas emissions of all sorts come from that particular source. So,
Really, that's crazy. That's a lot.
yeah.
That's a lot of farting cows.
Well, look. In all fairness to the cows, it's not farts. It's more belches. It comes out of their stomach, comes up out of their stomach.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right.
So and
Okay.
the thing to explain, of
So
course, is
it's not really a. Okay. So. Sorry,
Yeah, I was
keep
going to
going.
say, the thing
Continue.
to explain, first of all, of course, is
Sorry.
that this is not carbon dioxide. So it's important to realize that there are a number of greenhouse gases that go into the overall greenhouse phenomenon, shall we say. CO2 is one of the biggies. Methane itself, which is what we're talking about here, that is in cattle belches, is another molecule, methane, but is also quite important as a greenhouse generating gas. So mitigating, getting to zero carbon or carbon neutral, we have to tackle all of these different forms of carbon emissions because they all have an impact on the atmosphere.
Yeah, CO2 is very much focused upon, but in reality, though methane does not last as long in the atmosphere in that form, uh, its impact, its ability to cause global warming is much greater than CO2 by quite a few factors. Right? Is that right? I've forgotten what the comparison is, but it's quite significant in terms of how the intensity of methane in comparison to CO2.
That number is not immediately in my mind either. Perhaps when we're talking about comparing different gases, it's also then worthwhile bringing into the discussion another gas, nitrous oxide. Lots of people know of nitrous oxide as something that you can use to juice up the performance of an engine, but it's also emitted from fields after they've been fertilized, and even by also in cattle rearing. So nitrous oxide is a very potent. I think it is probably one of the most commonly emitted potent gases, 300 times per molecule more potent than carbon dioxide. So nitrous oxide is another baddie, if you like, that we have to focus on. And cattle rearing, as I say, is a significant part of the story there. In reaching climate neutrality, so to speak, if we want to, it's not just about carbon. In other words, nitrous oxide would also have to be on the list of things to be eliminated.
Yeah, yeah, okay. Well, that's an interesting point, and maybe, well, that sort of that sits at a higher level. So what we can maybe talk about now is, well, okay, well, what are the implications then of a global food supply based very heavily upon the production of ammonia as a or fertilizer, and that fertilizer being produced through or alongside the emittance of CO2. And if we have aspirations for something like an electric economy, perhaps, or a renewable economy, that's a major industry that's going to have to be revamped, and that's well, firstly, the Haber-Bosch process itself I'm sure, is quite energy intensive. So that's something that's going to have to require a lot of energy just to power that to begin with. But then to produce that hydrogen from the first point as green hydrogen, if we're being let's say optimal here. How do you see that playing out in terms of that being a sort of possible, how easy of that transition that's going to be, moving away from, say, black hydrogen to green hydrogen for ammonia? And because it sounds like there's not really, if we want our food supply to continue, we still, in the way that it is, barring some major innovation in crop genetics, which already happened, I think, in the Green Revolution in the 60s or so, then we're still going to be producing and using these fertilizers, and they're still going to be emitting, say, through nitrous oxides, that's a whole other sort of question. But just first going back to the hydrogen production, how do you see that playing out?
Yeah, so we talked about this to some extent in the previous podcast, but the
Mm.
one of the steps there is to use green hydrogen into the Haber-Bosch process. So
Hmm.
the chemistry remains the same, but the source of the hydrogen is now different, and that green hydrogen. What we mean by that, of course, is that it's made with renewable energy. That's the energy source, and then the hydrogen carries the energy into the process, so to speak. So at that point, we've eliminated all of the carbon, the fossil carbon that otherwise is associated with producing fertilizers. A step that's happening already. A lot of research going in around the world on doing this most efficiently, etc., and including in our own group on a next generation technology that even removes the need for the Haber-Bosch process itself and just relies on electrolysis to make the ammonia. That process
Oh,
becomes
okay.
more,
Yes.
yeah, yeah. That process becomes more significant in when we start talking about nitrous oxide emissions from fields, because the ability to in the sort of electrolysis approach to producing fertilizers allows it to be done on a relatively small scale, even on a farm by farm scale. And what that would mean is that
Mm.
every farmer has got control over the production of fertilizers as needed, when needed, where needed, so to speak. And by being able to apply them often, for example, in the Australian context, this could be in irrigation water, apply the fertilizer more regularly. Um, under a careful management, in other words, could lower the nitrous oxide emissions from the soil. Part of the emissions problem is that occasional heavy duty application of fertilizers just means that the nitrogen is just sitting in the soil, ready to be consumed, if you like, by bacteria, which oxidize it and produces the nitrous oxide, which is lost into the atmosphere, and therefore is not available to the plants.
Mm.
So this is a process that is of no
It's a
good to
waste.
anybody. Yeah, so we really want the plants to
Mm.
take it up before anything else happens to it. Is the way to put it. So new generations of technology around fertilizer production will also allow us to address the nitrous oxide problem. There's a bit more of a problem, so that's at the crops level and the grassland level. When it comes to livestock rearing, I think different management practices with the herds will allow us to reduce the nitrous oxide emissions from uh, from that activity. So I think there are definitely things happening here which will allow emissions from
Mm.
the agricultural sector as a whole to be reduced. And there's no question that the farming community is desperately keen to see this happen.
I think the use of seaweed as a feedstock for cattle is being implemented as a way in which to reduce methane emissions, and I think that that's possibly something that I just came across this the other day during just some readings for work, and uh, that may even be that may even be in the process of being uh, credited as a carbon farming initiative methodology under um, the Australian government's emissions reduction fund. But I'm not entirely sure about that. I'd have to go and look at that. But yeah, there's the issue's clearly been tackled from lots of angles, and I wasn't sure if I heard correctly. This process of electrolysis for creating ammonia or what some form of nitrogen fertilizer as a replacement to the Haber-Bosch process. Does that still require the green hydrogen initially, or does that bypass the production of green hydrogen and hydrogen altogether?
The latter, so it bypasses hydrogen altogether. That's not part of the
Mm.
process anymore. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So that's obviously very useful and helpful because there's if green hydrogen is let's a founding supply, let's say a bedrock supply of green energy going into the future, there's going to be demand for from all sorts of sectors for that hydrogen. And so a question there, which I wondered if you might have something of an opinion on, was what sectors do you think are going to have the highest demand for this green hydrogen, and which ones do you think are going to get it first and be able to reduce their emissions directly? Because there's a lot of money being thrown around at the moment for offsetting emissions and reducing one's emissions. And so these big industries, if you can get your green hydrogen first, then you've got a huge financial advantage over others, and even players within that industry, for example. So
Yeah, I think there's little question that from if free market economics kind of rules the day, there's no question that the fertilizer application of green hydrogen would always take precedence. Quite simply because, and it's important to at this point in time to kind of note what's happened with the price of fertilizers over the last couple of years. It's just astronomical changes in price, which is extremely difficult for farmers to deal with. Just to give you an example of this, there's a farmer in South Australia, a wheat farmer in South Australia, who has been very much engaged with our efforts in this regard for a number of years, and she supplies us with very useful information about what she applies and when she applies for fertilizers, etc., etc. But in round numbers, she uses approximately 1,000 tons. Just think about that. That's a lot of
tons.
material. Yeah. And that all has to be arranged to come in relatively sort of on time before it's applied. The urea is not advised that it sits around on the farm for long. Sorry?
That's annual usage?
That's annual usage. Sorry, yes,
1,000
that's
tons
right. So
annually.
1,000 tons per year.
That's a lot
and
of stuff. Yeah.
Right. No, the price of that has risen from approximately something of the order of $500 a ton to something of the order of $2,000 a ton just over the last couple of years.
That's outrageous.
So $2,000 a ton with 1,000 tons is $2 million worth of fertilizer. And that, fully 3/4 of that was sort of an unexpected increase in price. So you can just see how this is troublesome times for farmers. So back to my original point,
what's the
though,
cause
which
of
is
that increase? What's the direct cause of that increase in price? Sorry, if you're aware.
Multiple forces, if you like, over the last 2 to 3 years, driving up the price of natural gas, which of course is a traded commodity. So it's impacted by a lot of different factors. So as the price of gas goes up, then multiplied up, so to speak, so does the price of fertilizers. And so that's
that
happened,
initial
of
feedstock
course.
then.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So as I say, we're all probably aware of just how in Australia our gas bills have gone up, and that's fed directly through, and multiplied up to the price of fertilizers. So then going back to the original question, which is what will be the way that this market unfolds? Well, the value of green hydrogen fed into the Haber-Bosch process for green ammonia, to produce green ammonia, is sufficiently high that I think it will under sort of free market economic sort of conditions will definitely will be the priority. And then you might say that the use of hydrogen as a fuel, which has almost the lowest value of all the things that people could do with hydrogen. So that application is liable to come last, or in other words, only when volumes are truly enormous.
Yeah. Okay. So hydrogen being directly used as a fuel rather than takes a back seat in terms of it being used as a feedstock for other processes, or for even being used for the production of ammonia itself as a fuel, not a fertilizer. Yeah, right. Well, that's fascinating. I'm not sure if there's anything else there that I wanted to explore on that topic, unless you had anything more that you wanted to say on that. I think that's painted quite an interesting picture of the as our last conversation did, of the nature of uh, processes and their inputs, and just the play of energy, I suppose, throughout our global economies, and the consequences that has when one's searching for alternative fuel sources and renewable fuel sources. And it sounds like, though, that a technology like the one that you mentioned of an electrolytic system replacing the Haber-Bosch process and being able to be instantiated even just at the farm level could really revolutionize that industry, enormously cut costs for farmers, and just flip the whole thing on its head and make farming viable again. Even if you're looking at $2 million a year annually just for the fertilizer to then grow the grass for the cows. So yeah, that sounds like a very powerful
Yeah,
bit of technology. Well,
absolutely.
so
And I think we should probably.
mm,
So just one last thought about
mhm,
that is I think it's probably important to recognize that we've discussed this in the context of Australian, trends or ambitions towards zero emissions, costs for farming, the need for sustainable farming, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But that it's important to note just what a big impact these international the increase in international prices for fertilizers is going to have in other parts of the world, where this could be the beginning of a significant food crisis in the world because farmers if farmers can't afford the same level of fertilizers that they might have used, to say 5 years ago in India or in Africa, where farming is a very marginal activity
mhm,
economically. So the first,
mhm,
fertilizer goes up, price goes up, then of course they just can't afford to apply as much. Net result is lower yields, and the result of that, of
mhm,
course, is ultimately in some regions is going to be starvation. So, I think
mm,
this issue surrounding the need for alternate sort of sources of fertilizer, so to speak, almost transcends the emissions issue. Um, Perhaps one
yeah,
should also connect right back when we were talking before about why did fertilizer prices go up? Because gas prices have gone up. Why have gas prices have gone up? And this is an unfortunate link to draw an inconvenient truth. The gas prices have gone up largely because the natural gas is seen as one of the cleaner fossil fuels,
mm,
so
mhm,
that various countries are edging their mix of energy supply towards gas or gas fired gas turbine based electricity generation, for example. So snapping
mhm,
up supplies of natural gas wherever they can in the world, because so they can lower their emissions. So
mm,
at that particular point, what you can see is a genuine tug of war between emissions lowering
mm,
and food supply. And it's not in the same country. It's often it's going to be the richer countries that can afford to pay the high prices for gas, and then the less fortunate will be able to produce less food because of the higher prices of fertilizers that ends up uh, indicating. So, unfortunate situation, and that's why it's desperately urgent that we find other ways of making fertilizers.
well, yeah, of course. And it's an interesting point, though, with the natural gas, because it's seen as by many, I think, as a sort of, say, for example, I believe the previous government, Australian government, sort of proposed Australia's transition to renewable um, fuels, a renewable economy, coming off the back of new uh, use and production of natural gas. And that was, not looked upon very favorably by many Australians. I'm sure anyone that might slightly call themselves a greenie. But what you've just been talking about calls into question the utility of that, the use of that natural gas, and even the necessity of the use of that natural gas, not just for energy supply, but for something like, um, for something like, sorry, there's just someone out there knocking on my door. For something like fertilizer production. And how can you, so that, well, then that calls into question, well, can we afford to not use natural gas? And can we afford to not, say, open some of these new plants if we're not able to, in the meantime, develop alternative ways of developing ammonia? And that then restriction of natural gas and those raising prices, destroying our food supply because we weren't willing to utilize more of it in under the guise of reduced emissions and renewable economy, and everyone thinking that by crushing the use of natural gas, they're saving the world and doing a good thing and forcing the advent of, let's say, the electric economy. So that's a tricky question then, isn't it? Because, well, maybe you think you're doing something good in that sense, but what you're doing is potentially spelling the downfall of our food supply, and particularly in these poorer regions, and putting our farmers worldwide into poverty, to say the least. So yeah, it's as these topics always end up being, and anything that is enormously systematic and um, um, intricate and complex like that, there's just so many aspects, isn't there, of the story that, and it's not a straight line to walk. And I suppose that's, from a purely pragmatic and dispassionate view, that's why this whole process is so difficult and not as easy as some people might think it is. And so it's not a simple solution of going green, is it?
No, no, and as you say, it's not a straight line either. We may have to make some compromises, like using more natural gas and less coal.
Mm.
That makes sense. But it also has that other consequence that you just mentioned. So we really got to manage that situation very, very carefully.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I think this conversation has highlighted that quite nicely, and that's something that we explored in the last one. And I think I'm happy to leave that there if you are, Doug. I believe we accomplished what we wanted to here, and this is a very useful little bite-sized segment, I think, for a podcast. Was there anything else that you particularly wanted to touch on, or shall we call it at that?
No, I think that's a good expose, so to speak, of the situation and how it's sort of evolving.
Awesome. So do I. So do I. Well, thanks again for joining me, Doug. I'm sure we'll have you back on again at some point in the future, and it was a pleasure to talk about these topics again.
All right, Lucian.
Cheers.